Ethiopian coffee is more than just a drink, it's a major source of income for millions. Did you know that coffee is Ethiopia's largest export and employs over 15 million people?
America loves coffee. In fact, it's the most popular drink in the country. More than 500 million cups are consumed every single day. But here's the thing, coffee prices have nearly doubled in just 5 years. And they could rise even more very soon. Because of a new tariff threat from President Donald Trump.
Ethiopia has made its first shipment under the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, marking a historic milestone in Africa's economic integration. The maiden consignment includes coffee, meat, fruits, vegetables, pulses, and oilseeds.
This is one of the most popular plants in the world. It takes about 3 to 4 years to grow before producing berries, which are picked, washed, pulped, dried, and roasted to make coffee. The world consumes about 500 billion cups of it every year, and it's grown by millions of farmers across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But there's a crisis on the horizon. This is the only area where the coffee plant can grow, and as man-made climate change warms the planet, it's shrinking.
Because President Trump's newest round of tariffs could make your morning cup of coffee more expensive. The White House just hit Brazilian goods, for example, including coffee, with a 50% tariff. Brazil is America's top coffee supplier, making up 30% of United States supply. Now, American coffee farmers hope that means you might be more willing to give their beans a try. I want to bring
Ethiopian coffee exports.
Now I'm in Sidama Coffee. From Sidama, it's around 270 kilometers to Addis Ababa. And I think the Sidama coffee is the best coffee. The price is also nice. You know, Starbucks also use the coffee from here. Here is one of the water wash factory. So there are many such kind of factories. Now it's ending of this year.
We are at a defining moment. Technology is moving faster than ever, reshaping how nations grow, how societies connect, and how prosperity is shared.
The world had grown used to surprises, but nothing compared to the economic earthquake that rippled across global markets when Ethiopia announced a record-breaking trade achievement. 546 billion earned from coffee exports to China in just 2 months. The figures stunned analysts, delighted African observers, and sent U.S. agricultural leaders spiraling into emergency meetings. The announcement came during an international trade broadcast that captured attention from Washington to Beijing. No one had predicted that Ethiopia's coffee sector, long respected but undervalued, was about to rewrite global commodity history. For decades, Ethiopia's coffee had been recognized as the birthplace of the bean, the origin of the finest Arabica varieties in the world. But it had never been positioned as a global economic force capable of shaking financial giants. The nation's traditional export pathways ran mostly through Europe and North America, with long-term contracts that paid modestly and undervalued the cultural and agricultural heritage behind every bean. But everything began to change when Ethiopia finalized a groundbreaking agreement with China that transformed the economics of coffee overnight. China's government, seeking to elevate its domestic coffee market to rival global consumption giants, launched an ambitious initiative to source exclusive premium coffee from Ethiopia and brand it as the luxury beverage of Asia. Chinese consumers were already shifting rapidly toward coffee culture, especially in megacities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing. Trend-conscious youth viewed Ethiopian beans not merely as a drink but as a lifestyle emblem tied to authenticity, tradition, and global sophistication. Demand surged at unimaginable speed. Ethiopia responded by modernizing its processing systems, digitizing its supply chain, and forming new cooperatives that protected farmers from intermediaries who had historically taken a significant portion of profits. The government partnered with technology firms from South Korea and Singapore to create a tracking system that authenticated every shipment using blockchain verification. This ensured Chinese buyers received only the highest quality beans, while Ethiopian farmers earned unprecedented returns. The system eliminated fraud, guaranteed freshness, and revolutionized transparency in commodity trade. Within weeks, Chinese social media platforms exploded with viral posts praising Ethiopia's coffee. Influencers showcased cups priced higher than luxury teas, while upscale competed to secure exclusive rights to specific Ethiopian regions. Soon, Ethiopia's coffee was sold out across multiple provinces in China. Importers scrambled for more supply, offering prices far beyond anything the U.S. market had ever paid. And then came the announcement: $546 billion in revenue in 60 days. The world gasped in Washington. The news triggered a frenzy. Reports flooded into the Oval Office, where the former president, now re-emerging as a political force, demanded an explanation. Advisors rushed to present graphs showing Ethiopia's meteoric rise. They warned that U.S. farmers already battling drought, rising costs, and market competition were completely unprepared to face a world where Ethiopia and China now controlled the most influential slice of the coffee market. American farmers, especially those in states heavily invested in coffee alternatives and agricultural exports, found themselves overshadowed by Ethiopia's sudden dominance. They had relied for decades on being the main supplier to U.S. consumers, with Brazil as their largest competitor. But never had Ethiopia entered the picture as a global titan with China as its primary buyer. This shift wasn't just economic. It was symbolic. It was a restructuring of global agricultural power. As the revenue numbers circulated, analysts predicted Ethiopia's GDP would triple by the end of the year. Investors flew to Addis Ababa in private jets, desperate to secure business deals. Airlines increased routes to Ethiopia's capital, and major corporations from Europe and Asia sought partnerships. African nations watched with pride as Ethiopia became a model of strategic economic transformation. Meanwhile, the U.S. agricultural community scrambled. Farmers held emergency meetings in Iowa, Georgia, California, and Hawaii. Agricultural unions demanded government intervention. They wanted subsidies, new trade agreements, and federal assistance to help them compete. For the first time, they realized that coffee was no longer a casual commodity. It was a battlefield, and Ethiopia had seized the high ground. Political leaders in Washington debated strategies. Some argued for negotiating directly with Ethiopia to regain access to premium coffee imports, while others pushed for developing alternative markets in Southeast Asia. A few more daring voices suggested that the U.S. should launch its own premium coffee brand to challenge Ethiopia's dominance in China, but experts dismissed the idea immediately. The climate, soil quality, and cultural heritage giving Ethiopia's beans their unique flavor were impossible to replicate. The former president was outraged that the U.S. had missed the opportunity to secure its position earlier. He demanded immediate action, insisting that America needed to protect its farmers at all costs. But behind closed doors, advisors acknowledged a truth that few dared to speak publicly. The U.S. had underestimated Africa, assuming the continent would remain a supplier of raw materials rather than a producer of high-value exports capable of shifting global markets. Ethiopia's rise was a wake-up call. Across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even Europe, economic experts held emergency panels discussing what Ethiopia's coffee surge signified. Many concluded it represented a new era, one where African nations finally took command of their resources, negotiated with major powers on equal footing, and reaped the full economic benefits. Of their exports, China celebrated the partnership. The government praised Ethiopia as a model for African economic independence and highlighted the success of the Belt and Road cooperation. Chinese investors quickly expanded processing plants, storage facilities, and distribution networks in Ethiopia, ensuring a stable flow of coffee to meet soaring demand. Meanwhile, global banks adjusted their forecasts. Ethiopia's currency strengthened dramatically. East African stock markets surged. Tourism increased as travelers flocked to see the birthplace of the world's most valuable coffee. Universities across Africa added new programs in agribusiness, supply chain management, and export logistics, citing Ethiopia's coffee boom as a case study. Within Ethiopia, farmers experienced a transformation unlike anything in the nation's history. Rural communities that had once struggled with poverty became centers of micro-industrial growth. Schools improved, infrastructure expanded, and families gained access to healthcare and better living conditions. Coffee cooperatives became powerful economic institutions, reinvesting profits into local development projects. But the most dramatic reactions came from the United States. Farmers felt threatened. Coffee processors worried about losing access to Ethiopian beans. Retailers feared rising prices as Ethiopia prioritized China over Western markets. Some even warned that if the U.S. failed to adapt quickly, its agricultural sector would suffer long-lasting damage. The former president, determined to reclaim economic influence, held rallies across the Midwest, promising to fight China's expansion into African markets and restore American agricultural dominance. But critics argued that America's real mistake was not China's involvement, but its failure to build meaningful partnerships with African nations earlier. Behind the scenes, trade negotiators quietly reached out to Ethiopian officials, attempting to secure new agreements. But Ethiopia, empowered by its success, was no longer willing to accept deals that undervalued its products. It insisted on terms that prioritized its national development goals, and China continued offering premium prices. This new geopolitical reality left Washington with fewer options. As tension grew, U.S. agricultural scientists proposed alternative crops to help farmers diversify. Tech companies suggested leveraging AI to improve domestic agricultural efficiency. Strategists recommended forming alliances with Latin American producers to counterbalance Ethiopia's influence. But none of these solutions addressed the core issue. Ethiopia had fundamentally changed the economics of coffee, and the world had followed. Months passed, and Ethiopia's coffee revenue continued climbing. The nation invested heavily in new technologies, irrigation systems, and eco-friendly production methods. China expanded its network of luxury Ethiopian coffee shops, branding them as symbols of global cultural fusion. African nations formed new economic blocs to strengthen their collective bargaining power in global trade. By the end of the year, Ethiopia's coffee exports exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. It had become Africa's fastest-growing economy, and analysts predicted it would join the world's top 20 economic powers within the decade. The U.S., meanwhile, had entered a period of introspection. Leaders acknowledged that the era of underestimating African economic potential was over. Some policymakers argued for building stronger alliances with African nations based on mutual respect and shared growth. Others remained skeptical, insisting that America must prioritize its own farmers first. But one reality was undeniable. Ethiopia's partnership with China had changed global trade forever. The former president watched from Washington as new reports rolled in. Ethiopia's agricultural sector continued expanding. Chinese demand kept rising. New export deals emerged across Asia, and U.S. farmers, still scrambling, recognized the need to innovate or risk being permanently overshadowed. The story became a symbol of shifting global power, a moment when Africa, long overlooked, emerged as a central force in international economics. Ethiopia's success was not just about coffee. It was about independence, strategy, and the courage to redefine an entire industry. The world had entered a new era, and Ethiopia stood proudly at the center of it. The shockwaves that began with Ethiopia's unprecedented coffee breakthrough did not fade with time. They deepened, spread, and reshaped the global landscape in ways few had anticipated. What started as a trade deal between Ethiopia and China had evolved into a seismic realignment of agricultural economics, international diplomacy, and global power structures. For decades, Ethiopia had been viewed through the narrow lens of potential rather than realized capability. It had been praised for its heritage, admired for its culture, and respected for being the birthplace of coffee. But no one, not even its closest economic partners, imagined it would rewrite the rules of global commodity power in a matter of weeks. The $546 billion achievement became more than a financial milestone. It was a statement, a bold declaration that Africa's resources, when leveraged strategically and valued properly, could redefine global markets. Ethiopia had not stumbled into success. It had strategized, partnered wisely, modernized aggressively, and negotiated on equal terms with one of the world's largest economies. The ripple effects of that partnership exposed a truth that many nations had ignored. Africa was not simply a supplier of raw materials. It was capable of shaping the future of global trade. Across Africa, the news became a beacon of possibility. Countries long under economic pressure studied Ethiopia's model with renewed urgency. Cooperative systems, blockchain traceability, premium pricing strategies, and regional branding were suddenly in high demand. Governments began hosting forums, investing in new technologies, and seeking partnerships based on fairness rather than exploitation. Ethiopia had cracked open a door many assumed was locked forever. Now other Nations prepared to walk through it. In Washington, however, the mood remained tense. The agricultural sector felt cornered, pressured to reinvent itself in a landscape where Ethiopia and China now dominated a market the U.S. once believed it would lead indefinitely. American farmers who had built their livelihoods on stable systems and predictable global demand now faced an unfamiliar terrain, one where competition came not from weather patterns or domestic policy changes but from a transcontinental alliance with unprecedented output and influence. The scramble across U.S. farming communities reflected a deeper anxiety. If Ethiopia could surge to such heights in coffee, what could prevent other African nations from seizing dominance in cocoa, tea, cashew, shea, or other high-value exports? Economists warned that if the U.S. did not quickly adapt, it risked losing influence not only in agriculture but in global trade negotiations altogether. The shock was not merely about Ethiopia's success. It was about what that success represented: a shift in global economic power away from old centers of dominance. Within Ethiopia, the transformation became visible in everyday life. Roads expanded into once isolated farm regions. New processing plants emerged in areas that had never witnessed industrial activity. Schools and clinics were funded by cooperative profits, and universities launched agricultural technology programs designed to sustain the nation's newfound prosperity. For many farmers, this was the first time their labor was rewarded with earnings that matched global value rather than historical undervaluation. Communities that had struggled for decades suddenly found themselves at the heart of one of the world's most profitable agricultural industries. China, for its part, continued to strengthen its foothold in Ethiopia's market. The partnership was not exploitative but mutually advantageous. China gained exclusive access to premium coffee while Ethiopia secured long-term investment, infrastructure development, and a guaranteed market at prices that exceeded anything the Western world had previously offered. The relationship illustrated the power of modern diplomacy shaped by mutual interest rather than ideology. Critics in the West argued that China was using economic strategies to increase its global influence. Supporters countered that Ethiopia had willingly entered the agreement and had negotiated from a position of strength. The truth lay somewhere in the middle. China had made a strategic move, and Ethiopia had skillfully transformed that opportunity into national empowerment. Meanwhile, global markets continued to adjust. Brazil faced its own pressure as China shifted more of its import volume to Ethiopia. European companies scrambled to redesign their supply chains. The Middle East saw a rise in boutique Ethiopian coffee franchises selling exclusive regional beans. Southeast Asian nations sought similar deals with African exporters, hoping to replicate China's success. It became clear that Ethiopia's coffee boom was not a momentary anomaly. It was the beginning of a new economic architecture where African nations could lead rather than follow. Over time, the situation forced the U.S. to confront long-standing assumptions about global trade. A nation accustomed to shaping global commodity standards now found itself reacting to them. This shift raised uncomfortable questions. Had the U.S. underestimated Africa's potential? Had it taken agricultural dominance for granted? Had it overlooked the strategic importance of building equitable partnerships with African nations before others filled the vacuum? Policy analysts urged a new approach, one grounded in collaboration, not competition. Respect, not paternalism. They argued that the U.S. needed to build genuine economic alliances with African nations, offering value that matched global standards rather than relying on old frameworks. But such changes required a shift in mindset, not just policy. As months passed, Ethiopia continued to rise. Its coffee industry became a global case study. Investors traveled from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East to witness firsthand the system that had shaken the industry. The nation leveraged its success to diversify, investing heavily in tourism, technology, and renewable energy. Ethiopia's leaders recognized that coffee was only the beginning. The goal was not to build a single industry miracle but a multi-sector economic engine powered by innovation and sovereignty. The U.S., after months of political noise and agricultural scrambling, eventually accepted the new reality. Farmers began exploring new crops and technologies. Trade officials opened channels for future collaboration with Ethiopia and other African nations. Agricultural scientists accelerated research on climate-resistant coffee alternatives. Slowly, the nation shifted from panic to adaptation, but the world had already watched the story unfold and history had been written. Ethiopia's $546 billion achievement became a symbol of Africa's rise, of the end of old economic hierarchies, and of the power of strategic partnership. China's role reinforced its growing influence in global markets. The U.S. was forced into a moment of reflection, reminding the world that no economic power is eternal, no industry unshakable, and no nation too small to change the course of history. In the end, the conclusion reached across continents was simple. Ethiopia had not just sold coffee, it had sold a new vision of global possibility. A vision where African nations control the full value of their resources, a vision where strategic alliances reshape global power. A vision where old assumptions crumble and new opportunities rise in their place. And as the world adjusted to this new reality, Ethiopia stood at its center not as a supporting player, but as a defining force in the narrative of global transformation.